My name is Molly Nolan. I'm from the History Department. What we're going to do today is explore some of the forces that since the late 19th century have displaced millions of people, both within their own country and outside its borders. We're going to look at how these displaced peoples, to borrow a terminology that was developed at the end of the Second World War, have been categorized and treated or mistreated. Are they seen as legal or illegal, documented or undocumented, stateless or displaced, which was developed as a seemingly more innocent neutral term? Are they seen as economically motivated or politically persecuted and endangered? Are they, in short, deemed by whose criteria, deserving or undeserving of aid and of rights? What I'm going to be speaking on is by looking at one key type of person in motion across borders, whose legal status was and is precarious, and whose claims to rights was and is tenuous, namely the refugee. Monica Kim is going to talk about militarism and statelessness, and Sarah Scraw is going to talk about immigration and immigration policy in the United States. What I want to do today is talk about the historical origins of the concept of the refugee and the characteristics of refugee regimes. And I want to make three main points. The first involves what creates refugees. Refugees are created by wars of all sorts, civil, regional, global. Think World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Syria, civil wars in Africa. Sometimes refugees are also created by natural disasters. Think of the tens of thousands of Haitians who are currently in this country and have just been notified that their temporary protective status has been withdrawn. They came as a result of the devastating earthquake in that country. But refugees are also created by the formation of nation states that are eager to police borders, limit access, and demand documentation of citizenship. These nation states often were formed in the wake of multinational empires that collapsed, and I'll tell you more about that in a little bit. And the successor states strove for a kind of ethnic and racial homogeneity. In short, the point I want to make is that the refugee is an integral part of the modern nation state, or a necessary counterpart to it. Modern states insist that the right to have rights depends on having nationality in the place where you find yourself. And gaining nationality in the place where you might find yourself is often extremely difficult. The second point I want to make in my remarks today is that the definition of who is a legitimate refugee, who is considered legitimate by the receiving state or international institutions, never covers all those who are displaced outside their borders. And it never includes those who are displaced internally. Inclusions and exclusions from legally recognized refugee status depend on race, on ethnicity, on gender, on where a refugee comes from and where they're trying to get in, on the motives or causes of displacement, and it is always international institutions and the receiving state that gets to make the call about what motives are. As it evolved in the first half of the 20th century is above all about laws and policing and not about humanitarian care. Of course, there are lots of organizations. These days, it's the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR, which is very active. There are numerous NGOs, secular and religious, that give aid, but they aren't the primary shapers of the refugee regime. They're responding to a creation and recreation of refugees shaped by wars, laws, and the policing of borders. I want to give you, before I look a little into how we got to the current refugee crisis, some statistics I think it's important to keep in mind, because much of this class is going to focus on what is going on in the United States. the history of our restrictions and exclusions. But it's important to keep in mind the global scale of the question of refugees. There are approximately 22.5 million refugees displaced outside, that is, people displaced outside their national borders. These are the 2017 statistics. 4.4 million of them are currently in Africa. 4.3 million are in Europe. 3.5 million are scattered across the Asia-Pacific region. 2.6 million are in the Middle East. And just under 500,000 are in all of the Americas, North and South. So keep that in mind next time Donald Trump rants and raves about how he has to cut down the number of refugees in this country. Germany is the only developed industrial economy among the top 10 countries hosting refugees. All the rest are in the Middle East, in Africa. That is to say, the burden of dealing with the current refugee crisis overwhelmingly is spread most unequally and overwhelmingly affects countries with the fewest resources to handle it. 22.5 million refugees is the highest absolute number of refugees recorded, although it is not the highest per capita, but refugees are not a new phenomenon. So one did what one could think of as the modern refugee, and the modern refugee come into being. Most histories of displacement, of refugeehood, begin on the European periphery in the late 19th century, because this is where a discourse of refugees originates, and this is where we have actual statistics about people displaced across borders. Conflicts in Eastern Europe, the Balkans, the Ottoman Empire, which includes what is today Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and part of the Balkans. Conflicts there began to generate displacement from the 1870s on. The Russo-Turkish War in the 1870s produced 2 million refugees. Massacres of Armenians later on produced more, even before the First World War. Muslims fled newly independent Bulgaria and Serbia because they were Orthodox Christian and thought they would be unhappy. After the Balkan Wars, tens of thousands of Muslims and Greeks fled, and governments began to forcibly deport people who lived in their territory on the grounds that they were the wrong nationality and you would prevent conflict and enhance security if you did. So Greeks living in the Ottoman Empire got sent back to Greece, even though neither they nor their relatives going back generations had lived there, and Turks from Greece were sent to Anatolia. What you got was a redrawing of the map, accompanied by an intensification of concern about borders, and also growing efforts by states to document individual identity. States no longer just wanted to know how many people were in a community and how much tax you could levy on a particular community or how many recruits you could ask the community to come up with for the military. They began to demand that the individual be made visible or transparent to the state. That you have documents like birth certificates, identity cards, and what becomes crucial for people who find themselves outside their country, passports to show that you had a legal existence in some place. The first major wave of massive displacements came in the First World War. Estimates across Europe are approximately 12 million displaced people in the war, but we have no statistics on the rest of the globe, so the figure will be much larger. When we think of World War I, we often think of trench warfare on the Western Front, soldiers just sitting and shooting one another in this barbaric form of conflict that didn't seem to affect the civilian population. But the war on the Eastern Front in the Middle East was a very mobile kind of warfare that sent millions of people on the move, some within their own territory, like Russia, some expelling them, such as the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, those who survived the genocide left Ottoman territory, going wherever they could. At the end of the war, you got a collapse of a lot of multinational sprawling empires and the formation of nation states which tried to include in their population only those people who were of the same ethnic group. The responses to it were complex. People were on the move. People were suddenly told, we don't want you in our new state. The powers that settled World War I with the Treaty of Versailles tried to protect minorities. They didn't try to deal with individual refugees. They said, we're going to single out whole populations and say, we, the League of Nations, tell you, a particular state, Poland and Hungary, you have to protect your Jewish minorities, you have to protect other minorities. They did not tell states in Western Europe that they had to protect their minorities. And these are the kinds of inequalities that you constantly get. It was assumed that a country like France or Germany wasn't going to mistreat its Jews. Well, that was clearly a rather catastrophic misreading of where history might be going. The second thing that the international powers did to try to stabilize populations on the move, which made everybody very nervous, was to sanction massive population transfers. And again, this occurred in 1923, taking massive numbers of Greeks out of what is today Turkey, putting them in Greece, and taking the remaining Muslim Turks from Greece and sending them back to Turkey. These people were also not considered refugees. And we're going to see this again. They were people who the powers that be decided should go back to where they actually really belonged and where they spoke the language or shared the religion. But there were groups that had no state status, that were genuinely stateless, and the two major ones after World War I were Armenians, those who had survived the genocide in Turkey, had no state to which to go, and White Russians, opponents of the Bolshevik Revolution who had left the Soviet Union and were deprived of citizenship as a punishment. Nobody knew quite what to do with them. So an Arctic explorer named Fridtjof Nansen said to the League of Nations, what we need to do is invent a fictive piece of paper so these people can at least pretend they have a status. And he invented something called the Nansen passport, which worked. And worked in part, I think, because it was given to people who could be classified as Christian, whether Orthodox or Armenian Orthodox, and because they were white. They were an acceptable group, and this, for a while, it protected them. By the late 20s, it looked like the refugee crisis was over. The 30s, it starts again with three groups. Jews fleeing Nazi Germany after 1933, and particularly after the Nuremberg laws of 1934, which deprived them of citizenship status. The second group were politicals fleeing Nazi Germany, communists and socialists who couldn't stay. And then in the late 30s, the 3 million supporters of Republican Spain who were on the losing side of the Spanish Civil War. But that was just a warm-up to the 175 million displaced people as a result of World War II. 60 million displaced people in Europe, 90 million in China, 20 million in South Asia, 1 million in the Middle East. Estimates are between 7 and 8% of the world's population was displaced in this period of genuinely global conflict. In Europe, the war saw the murder of millions of people and the movement of millions and others. There was, of course, the Holocaust, which killed 6 million Jews and 3 million others, Sinti, Roma, Poles, and Russians. But there were another 11 or 12 million people who Nazi Germany took from all over Europe and employed as forced or slave laborers within the Nazi economy. And when you got to the end of the war, there were all of these people displaced outside of their borders. There were as well a much smaller number of survivors of the Holocaust, most of whom had survived, by the way, not in hiding, but by going east into the Soviet Union and surviving there and coming back west at war's end. There were three options for what could happen to them that were debated by the emerging UN and the victorious powers. Encourage people to return home voluntarily, repatriate them in a more compulsory manner, or resettle them in a third country. And these are essentially the three responses that will come up in every single refugee crisis down to this day. There were problems with each in World War II. Lots of people had no desire to self-repatriate themselves back to, say, Poland if you were Jewish, or to Hungary if you were Jewish, and the ones who did often found themselves faced with pogroms and moving back west and becoming a displaced person. States in Eastern Europe wanted compulsory repatriation. And the American government, the British government, and initially the United Nations organizations in charge endorsed compulsory repatriation. People should be put back in the nationality box which they wanted. Then comes the Cold War, and they decide they don't want to repatriate them in a forced way back to Eastern Europe. Resettlement then, as now, was always hard because you have to find countries who are willing to take refugees. When the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was proclaimed at the end in 1948, it gave people the right, it listed as a human right, the right to leave the country in which you lived, but you weren't guaranteed the right to be taken in another country. It's the basic asymmetry in which refugee regimes developed. Those who were unwilling or unable to repatriate in Germany, mostly Jews, were put in what were called DP camps, displaced person camps, which were usually former Nazi labor camps and concentration camps that had held political prisoners. The irony of Jewish survivors being put in camps that had previously been used by the Nazis against Jews and politicals was not lost on the refugees. These camps were run, and this is when the refugee camps come into being, by two groups: the UN Relief and Rehabilitation Agency, UNRWA, and a series of Jewish agencies, the Joint Distribution Committee, HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. Those who were in the camps, who were without nationality and who were stateless, often became, as happens with refugees, increasingly nationalistic. They demanded vociferously a state of their own, and that state was Israel. Those who were taking care of them, and I think Monica and others will talk more about this, always got treated in a mixed way. It's not just current refugees or refugees of color, but almost any refugees. On the one hand, the people caring for them offered material aid, felt sympathy for them. On the other hand, they tended to look down on them and to say, you're not behaving in a proper manner. You're not being grateful enough, you're being obstreperous, you're acting out, you're disruptive, you're engaging in criminal behavior, or alternately, they were criticized for being passive, apathetic, not taking control of their own lives. From the beginning of this modern refugee regime, it turned out being a good refugee was a very hard thing, and there were many conflicting demands. What you got set up in 1945 was a series of efforts to sort of stabilize definitions of what a refugee was. UNRWA was active sort of 44 to 46, and then the United States decided it was too nice to the Soviet Union, and it set up another organization, the International Refugee Organization, and then hoped that international organizations dealing with refugees would disappear. Other countries said the problem still exists. There's still hundreds of thousands of people, among other places, sitting in Germany with no place to go. So in 1950, the UN set up the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees. It was through this body, or this body was guided by, the 1951 UN Convention relating to the status of the refugee. The purpose of this was to safeguard the rights and welfare of persons who were outside the country of their nationality before January 1st, 1951, and who could establish, quote, a well-founded fear of being persecuted on grounds of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. This definition is really important because it sets the framework for inclusions and exclusions, temporal, spatial, in terms of kind of fears and persecution that drive people into exile. It was time limited, and the assumption was that refugees would never occur again, so anything that happened after 1950 was excluded. Its remit was focused only on Europe, and I'll tell a bit more about that. It was a definition that assumed there's a sharp division between people who moved because they were scared of being politically persecuted or they had actually been politically or religiously threatened, and those who were moving for economic reasons. And the reasons people move are so complexly intertwined and entangled with one another that it's often hard to pull them apart. If you are a minority and you've lost your job and you leave, is that an economic motivation, or is it because the state is politically defining you as someone who cannot make a living? These kinds of things the refugee regime doesn't want. It was also does not pay any attention to kinds of discrimination or persecution on issues relating to gender and sexuality. And finally, it ignores the problem of internally displaced people, as it does to this day. Okay. The modern refugee regime was defined so as to help white Europeans, but white Europeans were hardly the only refugees. And I want to talk about a few other cases very briefly. When British India gained independence in 1947 and was divided between India and Pakistan, 7.5 million Hindus and Sikhs and 6 million Muslims crossed the new borders in East and West Pakistan. It was a massive and rapid and unplanned movement that caused enormous social and familial disruption and was accompanied by large-scale violence and death. But those displaced by the partition didn't get classified as refugees. Like Greeks and Turks before them, they were assumed by the powers that be to have gone to the state where they belonged or should belong and where they would be guaranteed rights. There was virtually no international aid to India and Pakistan, and the situation did not improve with the 1951 Convention on Refugees, as it had no provisions for helping an area outside of Europe, and India and Pakistan refused to sign that convention precisely because of its Eurocentrism. In East Asia, in China, the main problem was internal displacement. Estimates are that 1/4 of the population of China was internally displaced during World War II. There were then there were refugees who left China completely in the wake of the 1949 Communist Revolution, during the Great Leap Forward and famine, and during the Cultural Revolution of the 60s. But China was outside the post-war refugee regime. China was not in the UN. Taiwan was the recognized representative of China. And the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the Convention were not said to apply. But the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, having ignored all of China, all of the People's Republic, did become involved in the refugees who moved into Hong Kong, which was still a British colony. And there it acted to protect all sorts of Europeans who were in China, who had gone to Hong Kong, and who wished to be either repatriated to their home country or resettled in a third country. And they did resettle about 20,000 Europeans from China in Australia, Brazil, the US, and Canada. The much larger group of Chinese who fled from the People's Republic to Hong Kong were not so aided or settled. In good colonial fashion, the British government in Hong Kong assumed no other country would want to take Chinese refugees, and give them any kind of permanent citizenship. So they devised all sorts of plans, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. The population of Hong Kong sort of quadruples in the late 40s and 50s. And what do the British in charge in discussions with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees imagine? Well, we'll have a contract labor system, and we'll have quote-unquote Oriental laborers go work on plantations in British colonial areas where labor is in short supply. In the end, they didn't do this, but these are the categories they think in. So you have a post-World War II refugee regime shaped by not only the Cold War, but by the persistence of colonial attitudes. The UN refugee regime also didn't help another major group of refugees, which were Chinese pushed out of Indonesia in the late 50s and early 60s, and who went back to the People's Republic. So one of the poorest and most disrupted economies has to deal with 100,000 refugees, who the UN ignores so completely. The expulsion from Indonesia is occurring when the UN High Commissioner for Refugees is having its first year of the refugee, and they never mention the Chinese pushed out of Indonesia. Then there is, of course, Israel and Palestine. The British mandate in Palestine was the one area in which, outside of Europe, in which the UN did become involved in refugee issues. But not under the UNHCR, but ultimately under a special refugee agency that deals only with Palestinians, the UN Relief and Works Agency, which was set up in 1949. Both before Israel became a nation state in 48 and after, over 1 million Arab Palestinians were displaced. Some fled in fear, most were violently forced out. And as you look at the article that was among the reading by Ilana Feldman, you begin to see some of the complexities of the refugee situation, in which she details how these people are all clearly displaced outside their borders. They cannot return to Israel because Israel will not allow repatriation, but not all of them can get classified as refugees. And getting classified as a refugee means, on the one hand, that you will get aid, and very valuable material aid, food, housing, education, medical care. It also means that you get a kind of recognition for the loss of your homeland. Why couldn't you get recognized as a refugee? It depended where you landed. It depended what your income was. And it also depended on gender. If you were a Palestinian woman and you were married to a Palestinian man, then you and your children could be categorized as a refugee. If you did not marry a Palestinian man, it was assumed that it was his responsibility to care for the children, and so you fell out of refugee status. Okay, I'm going to wind up here. This gives you some sense of the contours of the refugee regime and its assumption that got established in the middle of the 20th century and that is still with us today. Scholars rightly point out there's not just one refugee regime, there are variations. On the other hand, they all share certain assumptions that I think we need to keep in mind. The refugee always has to meet stringent criteria and prove legitimacy and worth, and it's the receiving state and international organizations that get to make the final determination of this. Exclusions are integral to all refugee regimes. In Europe and the US, preference has long been given to those who are white and Christian, as opposed to colored or Muslim, and to those who are seen as being persecuted by left-wing regimes rather than right-wing and authoritarian regimes. Most states spend much more money policing borders, rejecting asylum seekers, and sending them home to third countries than they do to taking them in. And in the post-Cold War era, from the 1990s on, the US, as well as its European allies, had ignored their role in creating refugees as a result of interventionist wars. Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iraq again, and Libya. These wars, ironically, are often justified as humanitarian interventions, as being undertaken because the West, the US, Europe, has a responsibility to protect people at risk from their own government. And in fact, these interventions put people at great risk. They make them refugees. Thank you.